Understood. I'll now write section 1 of the story script, faceless style, without headings, no scene labeling, no repetitions, and keeping it direct with tension, quality, and flow. It will run at least 760 words. Clara had grown used to the silence in her marriage, the kind of silence that spread across the house and filled her nights with a hollow ache. Daniel was always gone, buried in late hours, his energy spent before he ever reached her. She no longer waited for him to touch her, no longer hoped he would notice when she slipped into bed in a silk nightgown that used to matter. The body beside her had become nothing more than a reminder of what wasn't there. That void, steady and cold, was the reason she'd started seeking comfort alone, in quiet corners of the night, behind locked doors, in a rhythm that was hers alone. On that particular night, Clara's loneliness had pressed so heavy against her chest that she couldn't hold it back. The house was quiet, Daniel nowhere near, and Ethan was supposed to be asleep. She slipped into her bedroom, closed the door with a gentle push, and let herself unravel. No words, no names, only breath and the sound of sheets shifting under her weight. She let her hands roam, desperate to feel alive again, every nerve stretched and searching. Her body reacted eagerly, as though it had been waiting for permission. She pressed deeper into the sensation, losing herself to the quiet waves she could control, to the heat that only reminded her how neglected she was. She didn't hear the door at first. It was the smallest creak, subtle enough to be lost in the shuffle of her breaths. But then a pause followed, an unnatural pause. She froze, heart crashing against her ribs, and turned her head. The doorway wasn't empty. Ethan stood there. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, just locked in place as though the sight had rooted him. Clara's stomach dropped, panic flooding every inch of her, and she yanked the sheets against her body. Her first instinct was shame, pure and raw, the kind that made her throat close up. This was her stepson. This was a line that should have never even been imagined. She should scream, demand he leave, cover herself entirely and bury this moment so deep that neither of them would dare let it rise again. But she couldn't move. The heat that had been building inside her didn't die with the shock, it shifted. Embarrassment tangled with something more dangerous, something she didn't want to admit. His stillness wasn't the stillness of disgust. He wasn't rushing away. He wasn't apologizing. He was watching. That Clara's breath caught, unsteady, and her body betrayed her by reacting, tightening instead of retreating. She pulled the sheets tighter, but not enough to hide everything, not enough to erase what he had already seen. The air grew unbearably thick. She didn't dare speak, and neither did he. Their silence carried more than words ever could, a silence that screamed with things unsaid. The seconds stretched endlessly, and every one of them carved deeper into her, etching the moment into something she knew she'd never forget. Finally, Ethan shifted. His hand moved against the doorframe, uncertain, his jaw tense, but his eyes didn't pull away. Clara's chest rose and fell rapidly, her throat dry as she tried to make sense of what was happening. He wasn't a child. He was a man, younger than her, yes, but his presence carried weight. She'd seen him in the house for months, quiet, respectful, always giving space. But now that space had vanished, replaced with something electric that burned between them. She wanted him gone, desperately, but another part of her, the one that had been starved for so long, felt something else entirely. She couldn't deny the pulse in her body, the lingering echo of her pleasure that refused to fade even as shame tried to smother it. She hated herself for the thought, but she also couldn't stop it. The thrill of being seen, the forbidden nature of it, clawed at her insides until she felt dizzy. Ethan finally stepped back. It was slow, deliberate, his gaze still holding hers as if reluctant to let go. Clara swallowed hard, pressing her lips together, unable to summon words. She watched him retreat, the door easing shut, leaving her alone again. Alone, but not the same. Her chest heaved, her fingers still tangled in the sheets, her body trembling from more than just what she had been doing moments before. When the silence returned fully, it was no longer the silence she had known. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, charged, loaded with a truth that could never be undone. Clara sank against the pillows, her mind racing with what had just happened. Her body still hummed, furious at her for stopping, but her thoughts screamed louder. She had been caught by Ethan. Not only caught, but watched. And she had let him. She hadn't screamed, hadn't demanded he leave instantly. She had allowed the moment to linger, if only for a breath too long. That breath was enough to change everything. She knew it. He knew it. Even without words, the truth had been exchanged between them. There was no erasing the memory of how she had looked in that vulnerable, raw state, no taking back the way his eyes had held her. The lines that had once kept their relationship neat and safe had blurred in an instant. Clara curled into herself, clutching the sheets until her knuckles turned white. She hated the warmth spreading through her body, the way her skin still tingled. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. But it did. It meant everything. And though she wanted to pretend it would fade by morning, a deeper part of her already knew better. That moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, but could already feel pulling her in. Word count 772 white heavy check mark. Would you like me to move straight into section 2? 760 words. Next, carrying the tension forward. Got it. I'll continue with section 2 now, keeping it direct, emotional, and engaging, without repetition, fluff, or headings. It will run for at least 760 words in faceless narration style. Daniel had been coming home later than usual, always with the same excuse of deadlines and projects that couldn't wait. I didn't complain. I didn't even question him. On the surface, I played the part of the supportive wife, but underneath, I was falling into a space I had no right to be in. That night, when he called to say he wouldn't make it home for dinner, Michael offered to keep me company. I told myself it was innocent, just a meal, nothing more. But even as I agreed, a part of me knew I was stepping onto a path I wouldn't come back from. We opened a bottle of wine, sat across from each other, and the conversation started as casual. Family updates, memories, harmless laughter. But the air shifted when he looked at me with that familiar intensity, the kind that made my pulse quicken against my will. He asked again if I was happy, and this time, I couldn't laugh it off. I admitted what I hadn't admitted to anyone, not even myself fully, that I felt lonely, even while married. His eyes softened, and his voice dropped lower. He said he had always known I wasn't meant for Daniel, that from the very beginning he had felt I belonged with him. The words hung between us, heavy and dangerous, and I should have stopped it there. But I didn't. The glass was warm in my hand, my thoughts blurred by more than the wine. I kept telling myself I couldn't cross the line, that it wasn't worth the ruin it would bring. And then he leaned closer, close enough that I could feel his breath, close enough that all it would take was one decision. I pulled back at the last second, whispered that it couldn't happen, and he nodded, but the look in his eyes told me it wasn't the end. I went home that night and told myself it would be the last time we'd get that close. But days later, a message from him lit up my phone. A single sentence: "I can't stop thinking about you." I should have deleted it. I should have ignored it. Instead, I stared at it for hours before I finally replied. That was how it began, not with a kiss, not with a confession, but with words typed in the secrecy of a phone screen. The messages grew longer, deeper, reckless. We talked at night when Daniel was asleep, whispered through the static of phone calls that felt more intimate than anything I'd experienced in years. He remembered details about me, small things I thought no one noticed. He made me feel alive again, and that aliveness was addictive. Every word from him fed a hunger I had kept buried, and soon words weren't enough. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never be repeated. But the truth was, it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like release, like finally giving into the part of myself I had been denying for too long. When he touched me, it was with a fire Daniel had never sparked. When he whispered against my skin, it was everything I had secretly craved but never dared to ask for. Afterward, I waited for the guilt to consume me, to crush me under the weight of what I had done. But instead, I found myself counting the hours until it could happen again. It was madness, and I knew it, but the thrill outweighed the fear. The lies slipped easily from my mouth. I told Daniel I was tired, that I needed space, that I had errands to run. In truth, every excuse was a doorway back to Michael. Family dinners became torture. Sitting across from Daniel, pretending nothing had changed, while Michael's eyes met mine over the table, carrying every secret we shared. It was unbearable and intoxicating all at once. Every time Daniel spoke about work, about plans, about the future, my mind drifted to Michael, to the danger I couldn't let go of. I justified it by telling myself Daniel had pushed me into this. His absence, his neglect, his inability to see me for who I really was. But deep down, I knew those were excuses. The truth was simpler and far more damning. I wanted Michael. I always had. And now that I had crossed that line, There was no undoing it. Michael began saying things Daniel never had the courage to. That I was beautiful, that I deserved more, that he couldn't imagine a life without me. He whispered that I should have been his from the start, that fate had played a cruel trick by binding me to his brother. Those words sank into me, poisoned me, until I believed them. Until I believed I had been living someone else's life all along, but with every meeting, the risk grew. Every glance, every touch in public, every secret message felt like we were daring the world to catch us. And yet, the danger only fueled the passion. I told myself it was worth it, that this was love, not betrayal. That what I felt with Michael wasn't wrong, only delayed. What began as a stolen kiss had turned into a life I lived in the shadows. A life where my husband's brother was the only man who made me feel alive. I should have been terrified of the destruction it would bring, but all I could think about was the next time. Because the truth was, once I had tasted it, there was no going back. Word count 770 white heavy check mark. Do you want me to move forward and write section 3? The final 760 words, consequences and truth, in the same style. Alright, here's section 3 written in the same direct, faceless narration style. No fluff, no headings, no repetition, and keeping it above 760 words. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Daniel wasn't a fool, even if he never said much. At first, I convinced myself he was too distracted with work to notice anything, but subtle changes in him revealed otherwise. He watched me more closely, lingered when I answered my phone, studied my face when I said I was going out. The man who once never asked questions had started asking them, gently at first, like he was trying to give me space to tell the truth. I lied anyway, with practiced ease, and every lie carved another line of distance between us. Michael had grown bolder. What began as secret touches had become demands. He wanted more of me, more of my time, more of my life. He spoke of futures that didn't include Daniel, whispered that I should stop pretending, that I should choose him openly. His words thrilled me but terrified me too, because I knew the reality wasn't as simple as he made it sound. Choosing him would mean destroying not just my marriage, but the bond between brothers. And yet, every time he touched me, logic slipped away that I lived in two worlds. By day, I was Daniel's wife, playing the part with a smile that grew thinner by the week. By night, I was Michael's lover, consumed by a passion I had once thought impossible. The contradiction was tearing me apart, but still I clung to both lives, greedy enough to think I could balance them. Then came the night when everything collapsed. Daniel had left his phone on the table, and when it lit up, I saw my own name reflected in the screen. My stomach turned cold. Somehow, he had read a message Michael had sent earlier, one I thought I had deleted on my end. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough. A single line that exposed what I had worked so hard to hide. I can't wait to see you again. It feels impossible to be near you and not touch you. I looked at Daniel, waiting for the explosion, the rage I thought was inevitable. But he didn't yell. He didn't throw things or curse. He simply looked at me with eyes I couldn't meet, and he asked the quietest, most devastating question I'd ever heard: was it worth it? I wanted to defend myself, to explain, to blame the emptiness between us, to say I hadn't meant to fall this far. But in that moment, every excuse dried in my throat. Because the truth was simple. I had betrayed him, and nothing could soften it. Daniel walked away without another word. The silence he left behind was heavier than any fight could have been. And I knew, even as the door closed behind him, that silence would echo louder than anything else for the rest of my life. That I thought Michael would be my refuge, that at least I would still have him. But reality is crueler than fantasy. Once the affair was exposed, the thrill was gone, replaced by the suffocating weight of consequences. Michael, who once swore I was his from the start, now looked at me with a hesitation that stung. He hadn't expected to face his brother's pain directly. He hadn't expected to see what destruction really looked like. What was once intoxicating became unbearable. Our conversations turned strained, filled with guilt and second-guessing. He stopped calling us often. He pulled back during family gatherings, no longer bold enough to hold my gaze. The man who once claimed I was worth everything seemed suddenly unsure if I was worth anything at all, and me. I was left with the ruins. Daniel moved out quietly, without demands or drama. He didn't take revenge, didn't expose me to the family. He just left, and in his absence, I felt the depth of what I had destroyed. Not only had I lost my husband, but I had ripped apart the bond between two brothers. A bond that would never mend. I replayed the choices in my head, wondering where exactly I crossed the line beyond repair. Was it the night I answered Michael's first message? Was it the moment I leaned into that first kiss? Or was it long before, when I chose Daniel for the wrong reasons, convincing myself safety was the same as love? The answer doesn't matter anymore. Because in the end, the result is the same. I am alone. Neither man by my side, both of them carrying wounds I gave them. Daniel with his quiet heartbreak, Michael with his fractured loyalty. And me, trapped with the knowledge that what I mistook for passion was nothing more than destruction disguised as love. People talk about forbidden love as if it's beautiful, as if it's worth risking everything for. Maybe in the beginning, it feels that way. Maybe it feels like fire in your veins, like finally being seen after years of invisibility. But what no one says is how quickly fire turns into ash, how love built on betrayal burns itself out. That I thought I had been denied something I deserved. I thought Michael was the answer to all the emptiness inside me. But now, looking back, I see it for what it was, a hunger that cost me everything. If I had stayed loyal, maybe I would have lived in quiet dissatisfaction, but at least I would have had something left. Now, I have nothing but regret that I married the wrong brother. That much is true. But in trying to fix that mistake, I made a far greater one. I lost them both. And nothing will ever be the same again. Word count 770 white heavy check mark. Would you like me to now create a final combined title plus description for the full faceless video script that ties all three sections together? Understood. Since you asked for section 1 of the infidelity script, minimum 760 words, I'll craft it as a faceless, direct narrative, no scene labels, no headings, no fluff. It will move with clarity, focusing on betrayal, tension, temptation, and emotions. Here's section 1, almost equals 760 words. The silence in their home had become louder than any argument they had ever had. Small exchanges were reduced to reminders about bills, questions about dinner, or comments on errands. Affection, once effortless, now felt like an obligation neither of them cared enough to pretend about anymore. He noticed how she smiled more at her phone than she did at him. She noticed how he spent longer hours outside, inventing reasons to linger away from her company. Both of them sensed the distance, but neither addressed it, because naming it would make it real, and neither had the strength to confront the truth. Head-on.it began innocently, or at least that was the excuse she whispered to herself the first few times. A colleague at work, Daniel, seemed to notice her in ways her husband no longer did. His compliments were subtle, never over the line, but the way his eyes lingered, the way his attention felt heavy on her, made her pulse race in ways she hadn't felt in years. She told herself she enjoyed the validation, nothing more. A little spark in an otherwise dim routine, harmless, controlled, manageable. But sparks, left unchecked, always threatened to become fire. When he first touched her wrist, it wasn't deliberate. Papers exchanged, fingers brushing, the warmth of his skin against hers. It should have meant nothing, yet she carried the ghost of that contact all day. She replayed it during dinner, while nodding absently to her husband's half-hearted recount of his day, her mind elsewhere. She felt alive, and guilty, but the guilt only deepened the thrill. That's how it always begins, the intoxicating mix of wrongness and desire. Meanwhile, her husband wasn't innocent either. He had grown close to someone too, though in a different way. A woman from the gym, Elena, with whom he shared long conversations before and after workouts. She laughed at his jokes, asked him about his goals, challenged him in ways his wife no longer seemed interested in. He told himself it was just friendship, but the time he spent crafting responses to her texts, the small rush he felt when her name lit up his phone, betrayed something deeper. He hadn't crossed the line physically yet, but the emotional tether was undeniable. Their marriage, in truth, was surviving on shadows. Two people under the same roof, hiding secrets in plain sight, both craving what they no longer gave each other. Nights spent scrolling, pretending to sleep, side by side yet worlds apart. Trust had become an unspoken casualty, and routine was the thin glue keeping the facade together. Neither wanted to be the first to admit that something was breaking, so both sought comfort elsewhere, quietly, carefully. For her, Daniel became the forbidden thought she carried into bed. She imagined what it would be like to let his hand stay on hers, to lean into the warmth instead of pulling back. She imagined his voice in her ear, the way he might touch her with the hunger she craved. Those thoughts made her heart race beneath the blankets, while her husband lay inches away, oblivious to the storm she was nurturing inside. She hated herself for wanting it, but the wanting only grew stronger with every encounter. For him, Elena became the mirror he needed. She made him feel younger, stronger, worth listening to. When she asked about his dreams, he realized he hadn't spoken about them in years. With his wife, conversations were practical, functional. With Elena, he felt seen. He found excuses to stay longer at the gym, even when his workouts were done, stretching the minutes into hours because those stolen fragments of connection felt more nourishing than anything waiting for him at home. Neither admitted it out loud, but both knew they were drifting closer to the edge. A point was coming where subtlety would no longer be enough, where unspoken thoughts would demand action. The tension in the air grew thick, unbreakable, and the guilt was no longer a deterrent. Guilt began to feel like part of the ritual, a companion to desire. They didn't stop because part of them no longer wanted to. The most dangerous part of betrayal isn't the moment it happens. It's the long silence before, the justifications, the half-truths you tell yourself to make the impossible seem harmless. She told herself she just needed to feel wanted again. He told himself he just needed someone to remind him he mattered. They convinced themselves it wasn't serious, not yet, nothing that couldn't be erased if they stopped now. But deep down, both of them already knew that lines, once blurred, are never fully redrawn. Their story hadn't reached its breaking point yet, but it was inevitable. Every choice they made in secret was a step toward that collision. A marriage cannot withstand two people living double lives. Trust doesn't survive in shadows. And though they didn't know when or how, they both sensed the reckoning was coming. One night, one truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. Word count 768. Do you want me to move forward and write section 2? Another 760 words, in the same style, picking up the escalation. Got it. Here's section 2 of the Faceless Infidelity script, written in the same tight, direct, no fluff style, with a minimum of 760 words. The shift happened slowly, disguised in the rhythm of ordinary days, until one decision tilted everything out of balance. She lingered longer in conversations with Daniel, their words slipping past work and into personal corners of their lives. What started as comments about long meetings or stressful deadlines turned into confessions about feeling unseen, unappreciated, forgotten. His responses weren't dramatic, but they carried the weight of someone who was actually listening. That kind of attention becomes addictive before you even realize it, and she was already hooked. Every smile he gave her felt like a secret gift, a reassurance she didn't know she had been starving for. Her husband, in turn, was deepening his own secret tether. Elena had become more than just a gym acquaintance. Their chat spilled outside of workouts, filling hours with small messages that made his days brighter. She asked questions his wife never thought to ask anymore, questions that made him reflect, laugh, and feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. When she teased him, when she complimented him, he caught himself replaying her words long after they had left his phone screen. His guilt wasn't strong enough to stop him, it merely sharpened the pleasure. He rationalized it by telling himself it wasn't physical. But desire rarely stays still, it grows, stretches, demands more. For her, the line blurred the day Daniel invited her out for coffee under the guise of a casual break. Sitting across from him outside the office, her pulse raced, not because of what they were doing, but because of what it meant. She laughed too much, leaned in too close, let his gaze linger without breaking it. Every second was a test of self-control she wasn't sure she wanted to pass. She told herself she was still in control, that she could walk away anytime. But the truth was, she had already chosen to stay. At home, the silences grew heavier. She caught her husband smiling at his phone once, and though he quickly hid it, the moment carved a hollow in her chest. She wanted to ask who it was, but didn't, because she knew her own secrets would collapse under the weight of such a question. That unspoken awareness built a fragile truce between them. Don't ask, don't confess, keep pretending. Both were guilty, both complicit, both playing a dangerous game in separate corners of the same house. He began skipping dinners more often, claiming late meetings or longer workouts. She began staying out later herself, blaming traffic or errands. They told themselves these lies were necessary, but the lies only widened the distance. The home became a place of cover stories, not comfort. What bound them together wasn't love anymore, but the routine of marriage, the inertia of shared years. Affection had turned into a shadow, intimacy replaced with secrecy. Her moments with Daniel intensified. The first time his hand stayed too long on hers, she didn't pull back. The electricity of that simple touch sent her spiraling, and though nothing more happened, she carried it like a confession she couldn't speak aloud. Her heart betrayed her every time he leaned close, every time his voice dipped into softness. She began choosing her outfits with him in mind, not her husband, not even herself. Desire reshaped her choices, disguised as ordinary decisions, until everything she did was anchored to him. For her husband, Elena had become more than company, she was temptation in plain sight. He noticed how she adjusted her hair, how she laughed when their eyes met, how she seemed to understand him with effortless ease. He didn't cross the line, but he wanted to. The thought of it played in his head at night, filling the silence where his wife's voice used to be. He fantasized about the what-ifs, the possibilities, the release from the weight of disappointment at home. His longing wasn't for love, but for escape. Both of them told themselves they were victims of neglect, starved of connection in a marriage that had withered. They didn't see that their hunger was driving the very decay they resented. Trust had already eroded, the foundation was fractured. The marriage wasn't destroyed in one moment, but in countless small choices, each one pushing them further apart. She knew she should stop. She knew the thrill of Daniel's attention was dangerous, that every smile, every lingering look was building toward a moment.